Welcome back to The Rancher's Voice, the podcast where the heart of agriculture meets the pulse of today's industry. From policy changes to pressing issues, The Rancher's Voice dives into the stories that matter most to ag producers.
In each episode, we will cover topics including legislation, leadership, and the agricultural lifestyle. So be sure to subscribe to The Rancher's Voice everywhere podcasts are featured. If podcasts aren't your thing, watch us on the Montana Stock Growers YouTube channel.
In this episode, public meetings are mentioned regarding grizzly bears. After this podcast recording, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced it would be canceling meetings. It is scheduled in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming regarding its recent decision to continue protecting grizzly bears under the Endangered Species Act.
Welcome to MSGA's Capital Edition. We're wrapping up week 3 of the legislative session. And how was your week, Ellie?
It was good. I think it was busy, just like I think I'll probably say every week until session ends, but it was good.
Yeah, we saw a lot of bills, and we're in quite a few bill hearings. We're starting to see the Senate pick up some traction and more bill hearings in their committees. So overall, it was a really good week. But what do you think one of your highlights was?
I think my highlight was probably the meeting that stock growers had with DEQ. I thought it was just a very interesting one. I actually, at the end of the meeting, I couldn't believe that it had already been an hour. I remember looking at my time and I was like, oh my gosh, this was a really interesting meeting. So
yeah, it was great. So for our listeners, we had a few members who have CAFOs in the state come into Helena, and we had a meeting with the director of DEQ, Sonia Nowakowski, as well as some of her key staff to chat about kind of a variety of things, one of those being current litigation that DEQ is involved with, but also just kind of a broader conversation about how our members can be a resource and be, more consistent in our, touch base with them regarding the permit process and the general permit.
Yeah. And there's some litigation surrounding all of that, isn't there? We should probably talk about that.
Yeah, so in 2023, Upper Missouri Waterkeepers filed litigation against DEQ, all surrounding the CAFO general permit, which is what most CAFO operators fall under. Many of our members are under that permit, and so what the plaintiffs are alleging is that the department, when reviewing and renewing that general permit, didn't put into consideration potential seepage from lagoons, as well as application on land and any seepage into groundwater. We would strongly disagree with that. Obviously, there's no evidence that happens, but that's kind of what created or caused MSGA to file for intervention into the case.
So what is MSGA's focus in the case? Like, what are we bringing to the case that is going to make it better?
Well, I think that the key perspective that we're able to bring is the business owner's perspective, right? We are intervening and as defendants alongside DEQ. DEQ brings to the table all of the scientific and processes that they have went through to renew that general permit, but we really are able to bring our producers and their testimony and their statements and how any changes or increase in monitoring when there's no evidence of discharge will affect their business and their bottom line.
Super important in cases like this, I think. And something I found interesting too in that meeting was the discussion around EPA and DEQ and how they kind of work together, and DEQ has to basically hold the same standards or better than what EPA is doing. So I did find that really interesting that the plaintiffs are still alleging that basically DEQ didn't do a good enough job when in reality it aligns with national standards. So
yeah, and I think that's important because there are similar cases that have been around the country. Currently, Idaho, California, and New York, I believe, have had federal cases with similar allegations, but now we're seeing some state ones pop up in Washington, Montana, Colorado, and so it's really important that while the plaintiffs are kind of alleging the same thing. There are different circumstances, different facts that play into each of those cases. And so we're really optimistic that, Montana is much different than the case that was in Idaho, where it was more of a federal case and it was against EPA, and this case is against the Montana DEQ. So we'll keep our listeners posted as we continue to kind of monitor that. Like I said, we have filed to intervene. The judge has not made the decision if our intervention has been granted, but we're optimistic that we'll be able to be a party in that case and keep you guys up to date on what that looks like moving into the future.
And I think no news is good news, right? For now.
Yeah.
Till we hear.
Yep. We're fully briefed and ready to go. So we'll just wait for the judge's decision. Another thing that we've kind of been waiting on for a while, it was a 12-month review that kind of rolled into more than 12 months, was the petitions that the governor of Montana, the governor of Idaho, and the governor of Wyoming filed regarding delisting the grizzly bears. And while the service took it upon themselves to initiate that review, we have finally heard from them, and they've rolled out some announcements in the last week or two. So do you want to give our listeners just a little bit of update on what that looks like?
Yeah. So unfortunately, the announcements from Fish and Wildlife Service were not what we were hoping for. They declined to delist the grizzly bear and instead decided to combine all the different distinct population segments across Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and Washington into one big population segment. And so kind of some of the concern there is just that it's going to make it harder to find a delisting decision down the road. Whereas, with distinct segments now, we can kind of manage those populations a little more closely and kind of get a better read on numbers and where things are at. So that was definitely disappointing.
I think it's important to note that this is just a proposal and there's a public comment period.
Yep.
So, that is something that we will be engaging with and continuing to talk about, that, the Continental Divide ecosystem as well as the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem are recovered populations, and there is data and science to prove that. But yeah, a little frustrating on, I know, landowners' ends to not see that delisting determination. But also a little frustrating was the fact that the map that they put in the proposal expands grizzly bear territory to pretty much Miles City in Montana. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, basically, like I said, they looked at the, distinct population segments and kind of the areas those were at, and then they just blew it up, basically. They said, these are areas where we could reasonably see grizzly bears in the next, I think it was like 50 years maybe. I think that's a little bit problematic because we don't know that that's where grizzly bears are going to be. And it also loops in a lot of ranchers and just landowners across the states that are not going to see grizzly bears, do not see grizzly bears, and then they have to abide by some different rules. I think, the service was really aware of the livestock implications, and they did try to implement some 4D rules, which are their basically exceptions. So there are still things that can happen, and if a grizzly bear is accidentally harmed when those actions are taking place, there's no legal recourse, there's no issues there. But again, that still just loops more producers into that bucket of having to manage things differently.
Yeah, looking at the map, definitely Montana has a big effect of that expansion of range. Obviously, into Wyoming too. Their map
and Washington. I mean, it was the entire state of Washington.
When really they're looking to introduce grizzly bears in Washington, and there's not even a population there right now. So disappointing on our end. Obviously, we will continue to work with the service and provide public comments. I think the other unknown factor is now that this proposal was issued in the Biden administration. Now we have a Trump administration. A lot of things are in flux right now and a lot of unknowns. So we'll kind of be tracking that as the Trump administration gets in place and people get appointed and things like that. But there are a couple ways that people can engage currently with this proposal. One is that folks can submit comments on the Federal Register, but there are a couple meetings as well happening.
Yes. So tomorrow night in Missoula, there is an informational meeting from 3 to 5.
So Tuesday night
on January 28th from 3 to 5. And then after that, so 6 to 8 is a public comment opportunity. I plan to attend both and listen to what the Fish and Wildlife Service has to say, and then also public comment there. There are a couple other meetings, Idaho, Wyoming, and then there's a virtual meeting as well on January 30th from 6 to 8 p.m. We don't have the link yet, but that'll be on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Grizzly Bear Management Plan website. So
if you're close to Missoula, I would encourage you to plan to attend or definitely take advantage of that virtual option. Or if you're a listener not in Montana, make sure to check out your meeting listings as well. There is going to be one in Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, across the region. So with that, that's kind of our two big updates from a state and national perspective. So let's dive into a couple of the bills that we covered this last week at legislative session and what's happening this upcoming week. The first one was kind of our first appropriations or budget hearing. Ellie participated in that. The Department of Livestock held their budget hearing with Section C. So each kind of agency falls within a section, and all of the natural resources agencies fall under Section C. Representative Schillinger is the chair of that committee, and so the agency participated and presented their budget to that committee. Not many new asks for the agency. They asked for a couple things, but what are some of the things you heard from the agency on some of those new proposals that they're asking for funding for?
Yeah, I think the biggest things there were in the animal health department. So as they're building the new vet diagnostic lab in Bozeman, just making sure that lab will have all the things that they need and the highest quality of things that they need, so they can be efficient and get good results for our producers. So that was definitely something.
And I think that ask was specific to equipment.
Yes, it was equipment. Yep. And then the second piece under animal health was just funding for more meat inspectors. So as we've seen more funding for meat packing plants, individual processing plants across the state, the department just wants to keep up with that demand and make sure they have the staff for that. Those were the biggest pieces. Yeah.
And now this week we are headed into DNRC presenting, so they have a couple days of presentations and then they'll dive into the details of their budget. So we'll be there to support DNRC and their budget as they go through Section C hearings this week. As we kind of move into the livestock category, one thing that we did want to flag for our listeners is House Bill 119, which is the bill that establishes the Montana Cattle Committee. That did pass out of committee amended, but we haven't seen it on the floor yet. And so this week we anticipate seeing it have a floor vote. This would be a great time if any of you are passionate or want to reach out to your legislators to do that in the next day or two, as we would anticipate seeing that second reading and third reading on the House side in the next couple days.
Also, kind of in the livestock department, we had the Department of Livestock a couple bills that they had kind of put together over the course of the last year. So Senator Kazmaier brought forward all three of these bills under the Senate Agriculture Committee. So basically, they were really statute cleanup. All three of them, two of them really were. The first was basically just revising laws around how butcher plants mark meat and hides. Originally, they had to both be marked. They're kind of changing that now just because of the way inspections work before and after and all the things. So basically just cleaning that up to be more in line with current practices. And same with this next one here, basically repealing the laws. It used to be required that a brand inspector went out to feedlots and inspected deads and then reported that to the owner of the cattle, and that is not done. Feedlot managers are very in tune with what's going on with their livestock and are in constant communication with their customers, and so they just repealed that to clean it up in statute and make things easier there. And then the third bill was allowing for digital copies of required documentation for livestock transport. So as most of you guys know, you've had to have paper copies and of inspection forms and things, and now you'll be able to have a picture of that. So it should make things a lot easier when you have multiple loads going, multiple trucks, and maybe you're switching trucks or whatever. And so if it's the same cattle, then you're good to go.
So we're seeing quite a few proposals also on the tax front. Obviously, property tax relief is a big priority for the governor. And so we're monitoring quite a few bills. House Bill 231, which is a bill that came or was a product of the governor's property task force, was heard. We continue to monitor that, as well as other tax proposals as they start coming down the committee halls. And then last but not least, this week we are seeing a new water bill, Senate Bill 178, regarding temporary leasing of water rights. There was a bill that was passed in the past that was similar to the intent of this bill. This bill kind of just expands and goes beyond what that previous bill was. So one of the concerns that we have is there's no notice for objection, and so current water right holders won't be able to object if water is being leased for temporary purposes. The quantity is quite a bit larger than it was previously, and so we will be going in to oppose that bill and raise those concerns to make sure that our senior water right holders, their water rights are protected and they have the correct and all the avenues possible for them to object when there may be adverse effects to those water rights. So that will be happening this week along with a few other bills, but that's our update for the week. We hope that you have a great week, and always feel free to reach out to us or visit our website at mtbeef.org for any questions. Also, just a quick reminder that on our website under the legislature, you are able to track the bills that we have talked about and see all of the bills that we're taking positions on at the legislature. That's it for now. We'll talk to you next week. Thanks.
Have a good week.